This morning we want to consider our devotion to God. In Colossians 3:2, we're told to set our minds on things above. And I wanted us to look at someone who did just that and take some lessons from this person so that we too can learn to set our minds on the things above and see what kind of difference it will make in our lives if we'll do that. We want to talk this morning about being devoted like Daniel. Most of us have heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den from the time we were tall enough to walk around and understand the story. It's one of the popular ones with the kids, which is kind of a scary story to be telling small children, but they seem to enjoy it as well because things work out well in the end. But what we want to talk about is how Daniel got to that point. How did he get to the point in his life where he was able to survive a night in the den with the lions? We want to be devoted like that. We want to be dedicated to God to the degree and to the point that he would protect us from those kinds of things. So to be devoted like Daniel, we need to learn God's law and train our consciences. You know, sometimes we think that a conscience is something that we're just born with, and everybody knows right from wrong. You're just born with that, and unless you get it messed up, you're fine. But the fact of the matter is, a conscience has to be trained to the things that are right and to avoid the things that are wrong. And Daniel was like that. In Daniel chapter 1, beginning in the first few verses, we find out that Daniel had been taken captive when Nebuchadnezzar came and took the temple. He took over the temple and he took the things from the temple and put them in the house of his God and put all the things in his treasury. And he commanded his chief eunuch to bring some of the people, some of the royal family and the nobility. And so Daniel was likely either a descendant of royalty, or at least he was in the nobility of the land of Judah. And it says that he was to bring youths, verse 4 tells us, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. And then they were supposed to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So Daniel, at a young age, was whisked away from home, kidnapped, so to speak, and taken to a foreign land, and there taught the literature of a foreign nation, taught the language of that foreign nation, and he was then expected to do some certain things. Now, he wasn't mistreated entirely. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years. These weren't just common slaves. He was trying to get a group of people that was going to be a special trained class of citizens that were going to be in service to the government. And Daniel was one of these. Verse 6 tells us, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. So they were of the royal tribe, Judah. And we know Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah better by their Babylonian, Chaldean names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Daniel we know better as Daniel, even though he also has a Chaldean name. It's Belteshazzar. And we will read about that some as we're reading through Daniel as well. But we call the book of Daniel. And so the chief gave them all these names. Verse 8 says then, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. Now this wasn't just a rebellion, oh, they kidnapped me so I'm going to go on a hunger strike and I'm not going to eat. It wasn't like that. He knew what God's law was concerning what foods the Jews were allowed to eat. And he knew what those rules were. And so he determined, I'm not going to break God's law in this. Now, I don't know what the king's food was. It could be that the king ate pork which would have been an abomination to the Israelites, to any Jewish person. And so Daniel wouldn't have wanted to eat pork. It could be any number of other animals that they were not supposed to eat. Many of the Gentile nations ate all sorts of animals, some of which we wouldn't even want to eat. But it could have been that they were eating rabbits and squirrels, for all we know. And those things were unclean to the Jewish person and would break God's law if they ate them. So Daniel had determined, I'm not going to defile myself. My conscience is going to stay clean. I am not going to break God's law to please this king. And he made his mind up about that when he was young. Remember, he was one of these youths that had been kidnapped. We don't know exactly how old they were. Were they teenagers? Were they young adults? We don't know for sure what age they were. But it's possible he may have been as young as 13 or 14 years old when he was taken in. He's going to be trained then for 3 years and educated and go to school to learn how to serve Nebuchadnezzar. And he therefore asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Now, it may have been just the way that it was prepared. Remember, the Jews were not supposed to eat blood. They weren't supposed to eat things that had been strangled. They were only supposed to eat animals that had been bled out. And so it may be the meat was even meat that they could have eaten if it had been properly prepared, but it wasn't properly prepared. So we don't know exactly what the deal is, but he even asked the chief eunuch. Now, if the chief eunuch had said no, I don't know what Daniel would have done, but I imagine he probably would have still done what was right anyway. He was just being polite and asking permission not to do this. He still would have not eaten the things that he didn't need to eat. And the other possibility is that they were serving them food that had been sacrificed to an idol. And that's something that would have been anathema to many of the Jewish people that cared about following God's law. So any of those things are possibilities, and we just don't know which one of those things it might be. But we need to learn God's law. Daniel knew God's law, so he knew what was allowed and what was not allowed. And that's how he had learned that. And he had trained his conscience to be offended by those things that it should be offended by. And we've got to do that same thing. We've got to be careful to learn God's law and train our consciences. And it's a very constant thing because our conscience is kind of like a pencil that after you write with it for a while, it can get dull to the point that it's hard to even make a mark on the paper. And then you have to sharpen that pencil. We've got to train our consciences. We've got to keep our consciences sharp so that they recognize the danger, so that that our consciences recognize when there is something that's sinful. The second thing that we've got to do to be devoted like Daniel is give God the credit he deserves. Too many times people are too eager to take credit for themselves and not give the credit to God. But Daniel was not like that. Daniel was considering the things that are above. And so he was considering when God should get the credit. Verse 20 of chapter 1, it says that in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them, this is Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These four, he's found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. So these guys are the top of the class. They're students, and yet they're already surpassing the guys that have the job that they're training them to take over. All of these enchanters and magicians, the wise men of his kingdom, these guys are already smarter than that. And in chapter 2 and verses 27 through 30, we see Daniel's response to this kind of a situation where he is wiser than the others. Daniel answered the king in this situation, and he said, "No wise man, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked." This is when the king had had a dream, and all the wise, they said, "Well, if you tell us the dream, then we can tell you what it means." And he said, "No, you're going to tell me what the dream was." That's kind of like I thought about all these psychics that are out there. And people call the psychic, and the psychic asks them first thing, "What's your name?" You know, if I ever talk to a psychic, well, you tell me what my name is. Start with that. If you're psychic, if you know, then tell me who I am. Tell me my name. If you know all these things. And so that's what the king did. He said, okay, no, you're going to tell me what I dreamed last night. Well, you can imagine how hard that would be to tell somebody what they dreamed. I have no idea what you dreamed. If you'll tell me what you dreamed, I'll tell you what it means. I don't know what you dreamed. But he's testing them. And so Daniel says, none of these guys can do that. And then he says, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. So he says, I can't do it. Not me, not myself, but there's a God who can. He can reveal the mysteries that the king has asked. And he has made it known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what's going to be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions on your head as you lay in bed. To you, as you lay in bed, you have these thoughts that what would be after this. And he who reveals the mysteries made known to you what is going to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than any of that are living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. So Daniel says, it's not because I'm so wise, it's not because I'm so special, but God has revealed it to me so that I can tell you. But the revelation comes from God. The interpretation of the dream is coming from God, not me. And so Daniel puts himself lower, puts God higher, honors God, gives God the credit he deserves. How many people will do that kind of thing? And how many people will take the credit for themselves as though they had done something spectacular? You remember one king in the New Testament, Herod, who spoke, and the people said, oh, it's the voice of a God and not a man. And Herod accepted their worship, their praise, and God made him die and be eaten by worms right there on the spot because of it. And so we need to understand that God will punish those that don't give him the glory when he deserves it. But Daniel gave God the glory and the credit that he deserved. Third, to be devoted like Daniel, we need to be obedient to authority. We need to submit to those who are in authority over us. That's not always pleasant. Sometimes the person who's in authority over us doesn't understand what we understand, doesn't know what we know, isn't even as smart as we are. That's often the case. But still, we're to submit to those who are in authority. And Daniel did that. We've already seen Daniel's revealing things to the king that the king doesn't know, and yet Daniel is still submitting to the authority of the king. In chapter 4, we see this in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king had again had a dream, and he's asking Daniel what the dream means. And this dream is not a good one. It's not a happy dream. And it's always tough when you have to give somebody bad news. But Daniel's dismayed about it. So the king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. And Belteshazzar, that's Daniel, answered and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. So even though Nebuchadnezzar is not a godly man, a godly king, Daniel is still in submission to him. He's his king, whether he likes it or not, and he accepts that, and he says, well, this dream's got a bad interpretation, so I'm hoping it's for your enemies instead of you. He's being submissive to that authority. He's honoring the king as he's supposed to do. In chapter 5 and verses 16 and 17, again, a different king, this time Nebuchadnezzar's descendant, is here in charge, and he's been abusing some of God's implements that were stolen out of the temple by Babylon. And God has written some things on the wall. Many, many tekel upharsin is the way the King James translates it. or at least puts it in English letters. It certainly wasn't written in English letters originally. But he says to Daniel again, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and you'll be the third ruler in the kingdom. Why the third? Well, because he could only make him third, because he's really only second. Nebuchadnezzar is still the king. He's first in charge, and his son Belshazzar is second. And then he's saying, I'll make you, Daniel, I'll make you the third right behind me. But Daniel answered and said, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. I don't want to be rewarded for this. And Daniel probably already knows that what he's fixing to tell him isn't pleasant anyway. He said, nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So even though this king is abusing his position, he's misusing the implements that belonged in God's temple, and he's using them in a drunken feast, Daniel is still in submission to him. Daniel is still respectful of him, even though we'd say, well, he doesn't deserve any respect. Look at a lousy king he is and how ungodly he is and rebellious against God. Why is Daniel being nice to him? And this is one of those things we need to recognize. Because we're going to have times in our lives where there are going to be people in authority over us that are not godly people. We're going to have bosses sometimes. We're going to have governors and senators and presidents that we're not going to like what they do and what kind of people they are. But still, we can learn the lesson from Daniel. We obey the authority over us, and we treat them with respect, even though we might not feel like they deserve it, because they hold that position. And the Bible tells us there is no authority except from God. Those who are in authority because God allowed them to be there. And so we need to give them the respect that position deserves. Even though, yes, they may be ungodly. They may be doing wicked things like this king was. But we may pray for God to bring us someone better, to put someone better in that position. Daniel chapter 6 and verses 21 and 22, Daniel again says to the king, this is the king who threw him in the lion's den. Now you think about that. How would you, after a night with the lions and you survived it, how would you feel about the guy who threw you in there? You want to be buddies with him? You want to rebuke him? You want to yell at him? You want to throw him in there? But instead, Daniel said, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm or no wrong. I haven't wronged you. I have been a good citizen, a submissive servant to you. Now, what did Daniel do? He did choose to obey God rather than man. And we'll talk about that one in a minute. But the fourth thing, if we're going to be devoted like Daniel, we need to give our best. We don't do it half-heartedly. You know, sometimes we do things that, well, I don't really want to do this, so I'll just give it a half effort. But that's not right. That's not the way we should be living our lives. We need to give our best, the best we have to offer at all times. Daniel chapter 6 and verses 3 and 4 says, this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps. That's satrap was one of the positions in the government there. Because an excellent spirit was in him. Not a mediocre spirit. Not a half-hearted spirit. Not a do what I can do, the least I can do to get by kind of spirit. But an excellent. He wanted to excel at everything that he did. And the people around him saw that difference. They saw him and recognized that, and he excelled above the others because of that. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom because of that. The king recognized it. He recognized Daniel does better work than these other guys do. Daniel's more devoted. Daniel does what's right all the time. Of course, that made everybody else jealous. But it says the high officials and the other satraps sought to find a ground of complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no reason for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. You think about that. How many people can you say that about? That they are so devoted on their job, they're so dedicated, they do such excellent work. And it's not, Daniel wasn't doing it because he loved the kingdom of Babylon. He was a Jew who had been kidnapped and brought there. But he was doing it because he understood what Paul later tells us: serve those who are masters over you as though you served the Lord. You're not serving them because they're great. You're serving them because God's great. You serve and you work diligently because that's what God wants you to do. Not because some man is watching over you, making you do it, or anything like that. But we need to give our best. Again, in Daniel 6:21 and 22, notice remember he said, I was found blameless before God. He had done so well that no fault was found in him regarding the kingdom. He had done no harm to the king, and he was blameless. Now that doesn't mean that Daniel never committed a sin in his life. All of us did, everyone except Jesus. But Daniel worked hard, and he was trustworthy, and he was dependable, and you always knew you could count on him to do what was right. Doesn't mean he was a perfect individual, but he was faithful. The fifth thing that we need to learn to be devoted like Daniel is we need to pray without ceasing. Daniel didn't make it to where he was by leaning on his own understanding or his own power. He got there because he was leaning on God. He was praying to God day in and day out. In Daniel chapter 2 and verses 17 and 18, Daniel went to his house and he made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. This is when the king had asked for the interpretation of a dream, and he wouldn't tell what the dream was. And he said, I'm going to kill all of you if you don't tell me. I'm going to kill everybody. And so Daniel tells his companions about it, and he's told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning the mystery, so that he and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. He was asking God for mercy, praying to God to help him in this very difficult situation. In Daniel chapter 6 and verses 10 through 11, probably one of the most famous prayers in the history of the world, probably more famous than almost any prayer except perhaps what's often called the Lord's Prayer, where the Lord trained his disciples how to pray. But perhaps this one is second to that one. Not in what was said, because we don't even know what was said. But this was after Daniel knew that a document had been signed, the document that said you can only pray to the king and no other God. He knew the document had been signed. He went to his house. He had windows in his upper chamber that were open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he had always done. And these men came by agreement and they found Daniel. They knew this is a way to trap him. They knew he prayed. They knew he prayed by that window facing Jerusalem. That's what Solomon had asked in his prayer when he dedicated the temple was, God, if your people are away from this place, if they turn their face toward this temple and they pray, and will you remember them? Now the temple wasn't even still there at this point. Babylon had destroyed the temple when they came in. Ransacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. But Solomon had asked, will you hear their petitions if they'll pray toward this place? And Daniel's doing that. He's bowing his knees to God. 3 times a day he's praying. He prayed and gave thanks before God. And the men, of course, found Daniel making this petition, and of course they drug him off and said, hey, look, Daniel's disobeying you, king. You wrote and said that he has to pray to you, and he's off praying to this other God instead. In Daniel chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, Daniel again says, I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and done wickedly and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. Now, he's not specifically talking about himself. When he says we, he's talking about as a nation. This is why the children of Israel are stuck in Babylonian captivity, because they had rebelled against God. They didn't follow his commandments. Daniel is the exception to the rule. He's the one who was still following God's commands, but the others had turned away. And he confesses even his nation's sinfulness, his people's sinfulness, not just his own. But he prays without ceasing. The 6th thing we want to consider is that to be devoted like Daniel, we need to obey God rather than men. We mentioned this idea earlier when it came to the praying to God. Yes, the man, the king, had said, can't pray to anybody but me. And that's what they caught him on. In Daniel 6:5, they were trying to find a fault with him. They couldn't find any fault with him concerning the kingdom or anything else. So they finally say the only way we'll get him is in connection with the law of his God. If we can find somewhere where the king's law is different from God's law, he's going to follow his God's law, and then we can get him. And that's what they did. And Daniel didn't do that ignorantly. He didn't do it lightly. He knew that law was in place, and he still went right in front of the window, prayed to God. He didn't go hide in the closet. He didn't sneak around and try to subtly disobey the king's order. He just boldly said, I'm going to still pray to God. Doesn't matter what the king's law said. I'm going to go right here by my window like I always had, and I'm going to pray toward Jerusalem to God. And of course, then they found him and caught him, and that's what got him thrown in that lion's den. And again, Daniel was wiser than the king, who was supposed to be in authority over him in that situation as well. But then if we're going to be setting our minds on things above, if we're going to be devoted like Daniel was, we need to put God above material rewards. There will be people that will try to sway us away from what God wants us to do with materialism, with offers of gifts and rewards and prizes. Satan uses those things all the time. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts. This was after he interpreted the dream, told the king what the dream was, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. But you know what? When later it came time that Daniel had to tell the king that God had said he's going to knock him down from being king, did he allow all those gifts that the king had given him to sway him? No, he did not. He still told the king the truth. God's going to cut you off like a tree at the stump. You're going to just be a stump. But if you'll turn back to God, you'll sprout back again. And that's what happened. The king went out and ate grass like a cow for 3 years, and then he came back to his senses, blessed God as the true God, submitted to God, even wrote letters to everybody saying, hey, everybody ought to worship Daniel's God because he's the real God. All these kinds of things. In Daniel chapter 5 and verses 16 and 17, again, the second king, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, probably this happened while Nebuchadnezzar was out there eating grass like a cow, and his son is reigning in his place. And he's saying, oh, I've heard you've interpretations and solve problems. So he's flattering him first. He says, if you make this reading and interpretation known to me, I'll give you purple clothes and chains of gold, and you'll be third ruler. And Daniel said, yeah, keep your gifts. It doesn't mean anything to me. What would it mean to Daniel? He had the honor that comes from God. Honor from an earthly king, especially one as corrupt as Belshazzar was, is not going to mean anything. But he says, you keep them. Give your rewards to somebody else. But I'm going to still do what I should. I'm still going to read the writing and interpret it for you. And you think about how devoted Daniel was. But he knew God's law. He put God's law above all else. He put God above material reward. We can do the same if we'll choose to do so. If you're here and you haven't put God above all, if you've allowed things of this world to pull you down, if your mind has been set on the earthly things instead of the heavenly things, it's time to change your mindset. It's time to start looking up instead of looking around. Keep your eyes set on Christ. Keep your eyes on God. Keep your eyes on the heavenly prize before us. Be like Daniel. If you're here and you have a need to respond to God's invitation for any reason, please do so as we stand and as we sing.